Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Government, those of you who are here in person and those joining us online. Thank you for joining us for this special one-day conference on public services, which we're hosting in partnership with UCL. I'm Hannah White, and I'm Director of the Institute for Government. And I'm really delighted that we're holding this conference today because I really feel it couldn't be more timely. Just a couple of housekeeping notes to say that we will be live tweeting the event from IfG Events, our handle, and using the hashtag IfG Public Services. And when it comes throughout the conference to question time, we'll be using Slido. So you can send in your questions if you're not with us here in the room via Slido. So please do that. So, public services. They somewhat dominated the general election campaign, and since we have a new Labour government, we've heard much about their plans to turn around public service performance and how they expect to pay for that. Now, we've had a little low-key election in the US since our own election, and we're very conscious of the huge consequences that could have for the UK's economic growth and also the ability of the UK to pay for the sorts of improvements to public services that we'd all like to see. We've now seen a budget setting out how Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves intend to pay for public services. If you want to understand what all the spending figures mean, I can recommend to you our excellent report published today, which we've somewhat ominously called Austerity Postponed, ? And that's on our website. If you're here in person, you can pick up one of these lovely handouts, which has a QR code on it, so you can access the report directly. But do have a look at that. But not till the end of the day, because we've got too much going on during the conference for you to be reading. We've got a brilliant programme of events lined up for you, and I'm delighted we've got so many fantastic speakers. We are going to be looking at some of the most pressing questions which face public services in the UK today. And I think it's, as I said, a very timely time to be doing that because it's clear that something needs to change, whether it's long GP waiting lists, crumbling schools, potholes. Public satisfaction with public services is low. We know that these problems were exacerbated by the pandemic, but serious performance problems had been apparent since before that. And according to pollsters, loss of faith in the Conservatives' ability to address these issues contributed to their defeat in the election. But public services have remained on the front pages since the election, whether that's because of the widespread rioting over the summer, the need to release thousands of prisoners early, or the inflation-busting pay rises this government has chosen to give to millions of staff. Labour has decided to make a lot of its poor public service inheritance, either directly in ministerial speeches or indirectly by commissioning a host of high-profile reviews, most notably Lord Darcy's excoriating review of the NHS. But while pointing the finger is easy, delivering meaningful improvements will prove much harder. The budget was a major opportunity to start this process, but much has been left to the upcoming spending review. So whether this new government can succeed will determine not only its future electoral prospects, but more importantly, the life chances of millions of people. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, I'm going to be in conversation with Michael Gove, who's going to be discussing his time in government and his thoughts on public services in the future. That will be followed at 10 a.m. by an expert briefing from my brilliant IfG colleagues, who will set out our new analysis of the likely impact of the budget on public services. After a short break, we will have a panel on health and social care at 10:45, featuring, among others, Dame Una O'Brien, former Permanent Secretary in the Department of Health, and Preet Gill, MP, former Shadow Minister for Primary Care and Public Health. At midday, we have a panel discussing fixing the criminal justice system, featuring Prisons Minister Lord Timpson. Following lunch at 1:50, we'll be joined by 3 ex-ministers to talk about the Conservative vision for public services and what that should be. So that includes David Gauke and Baroness Nicky Morgan. And then at 3:20, we will be having a panel on public services funding, featuring Paul Johnson and Rachel Sylvester, among others. And our last event of the day, as I'm sure you all know, is an in-conversation with David Blunkett, another reforming former Secretary of State. So a lot to look forward to. No doubt many thought-provoking discussions, and looking forward to hearing all of your questions and interventions. But before we start the first session, I'd like to welcome on stage Marc Stears, who's Director of the UCL Policy Lab, just to say a few words. Thanks, Marc.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. It is almost impossible always to follow Hannah, and certainly impossible to be between you and Michael Gove, so I shall keep my reflections short. But just wanted to give you a big warm welcome on behalf of University College London. We have been passionate about the future of public services since our foundation almost 200 years ago. But as Hannah was saying, that passion is particularly intense at the moment, because it is clear from all of our work that communities across the country feel as if they're not receiving the support from their services that they require in order to be able to go about their daily lives well. And that feeds an instability that goes right to the heart of trust and belief in our democratic system. So at UCL, we firmly believe that getting our public services right so that they serve the public is a fundamental part of all of our civic purpose in the years ahead. And two thoughts about the sessions that we have today. The first is that there's no better partner for this work, and obviously Hannah and the Institute for Government, we've long been inspired by their ability to bring together people of all different backgrounds, ideological persuasions, sorts of expertise to work out how government can improve. It's wonderful to see the work that you do day in, day out. And also our academic colleagues at UCL, I think are, if I'm allowed to say it, sort of unique in the world of British academia, because they believe across the piece that we need to collaborate effectively across disciplinary boundaries, but also across the boundary between academia and non-academia. So today you'll get the chance to hear some of my inspiring colleagues who really have been at the forefront of new thinking on public services, but they haven't done that just by being in a library or in a lab. They've done it by developing deep partnerships with those people who are on the front line, delivering our services, receiving our services, and thinking imaginatively about how they may be better for the future. So with that, have a wonderful day. We're delighted to be involved, and on behalf of UCL, thank you so much to the Institute for Government for allowing us to partner today.
Fantastic. Well, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Gove here today for our first session for an In Conversation, and we're very much looking forward to hearing about your reflections on your experience in government and your thoughts about what may be to come.
Sure.
Michael needs very little introduction, but just to say, of course, he's recently appointed as editor of the Spectator. Congratulations.
Thank you.
But the IfG is really interested in you because you spent so long as a Secretary of State in the context of this conference, working on many of the really interesting public service issues that we're going to be talking about today. So including, of course, as Secretary of State for Education, Justice and actually levelling up. Michael was one of the longest-serving ministers in the last government, one with perhaps the most ambitious plans for public service reform, and arguably one of the most successful at making those happen. So, as I say, that's why we're so interested in talking to you today. And I want to reflect, as I say, a little bit on your time in office, explore any lessons you may have for the new Labour government, and hear any advice you have for your former colleagues now they're in opposition. So I'm going to start with some questions of my own, and then I'll come to the audience, and we also have Slido in operation, so we can take questions from online. I'll start, if I may, with the budget. I'm interested to hear what you made of the public service funding decisions which Rachel Reeves set out.
Well, I can. Well, first of all, Hannah, thank you very much for your kind words, and lovely to be here. Secondly, I think that the central problem with the budget is that the biggest area of new expenditure is in healthcare, and we do not yet know what the government's plan for NHS reform is. There is a real problem when you have a significant additional sum of money being devoted to any public service without a clear route map for how that extra expenditure will be accompanied by a reform in order to ensure that the incentives within the system are aligned effectively in order to make sure that that money is spent properly. And to be fair to the government, I think Alan Milburn was making that point very clearly at the weekend when he acknowledged that the default position of the NHS, like so many public services, is just to say more, 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 without having clarity about where accountability lies for improvement and productivity.
But it is clear, isn't it, that demand is rising for all sorts of health services, that there are lots of backlogs in health services, that the technologies and the treatments we're using for health are rising. So the cost of them is rising. So it's not unreasonable to expect that there's going to need to be an uplift in NHS spending. No,
it's not irrational at all to believe that the NHS is the public service most in need of improvement, and the statistics are bleak. We have the lowest healthy life expectancy of any country in Western Europe, and the numbers on waiting lists are and have been for some time now, certainly since COVID, unacceptably high. And when it comes to mortality rates for most cancer conditions, we do lamentably poorly. So there are many, many good reasons why, and two other things as well. One, the number of people who have opted to go for private healthcare for a number of procedures has risen dramatically in the last few years. So absolutely there is a case for improving the NHS. The question would be, why is it that productivity hasn't improved within the NHS over the course of the last however many years? Most of them, obviously, when Conservatives were in charge, one has to acknowledge. And secondly, how does one ensure that this additional money doesn't simply go into pay increases and also into the pockets of the private sector, who are in a position to be able to alleviate some of the pressure on waiting lists, but in so doing, they're not, as they take that money out, we're not actually doing anything to improve the delivery within the NHS overall.
And I mean, I think that's a good point, but one of the things, I mean, not just in the NHS, but one of the things across the piece that the government has decided to spend money on is investing in capital.
Yes.
And that is certainly an issue for the NHS, but also public services more generally, whether it's RAC or school buildings and so on. So do you reflect, when you look back on your time in government, do you think that, given the maintenance backlog we now have, it was a mistake to make such big cuts to capital budgets in 2010?
I'm not sure, because part of the question is, as ever, bang for buck. So to take a particular example, when we came in 2010, the cost of a new secondary school was at least £20 million, and in some cases more, 30, 40 million pounds, to provide a new secondary school. We managed, not me, but the work of brilliant people in the civil service, and a chap who's still in civil service, actually, called Mike Green, who we brought in from Boots. We were able to reduce the costs of new schools by a third. And part of that was making sure that you had a uniformity of design, for example, and making sure that we reformed the procurement framework. So, yes, you do need to take account of investment in capital, but you also need to make sure that you're driving efficiency. Two other things that I would say. Investment in capital can be investment in, particularly in the NHS, in the technology that makes a difference. Or it can be investment in less effective and less efficient capital stock. The other thing is that if one were looking rationally, and this is politically extremely difficult, if one were looking rationally at how the NHS is organised, we probably have too many hospitals and many of them in the wrong places. But the final thing that I would also say is that across the public realm, one of the challenges that we have is that there are many buildings which are coming to the end of their natural lives because of the methods of construction that were chosen in the 60s and 70s. And it was something that was brought home to me, particularly when I was in the levelling up department, when we were looking at social housing. Because one of the problems that we have in social housing is not just that there isn't enough, it is also the case that an overwhelmingly large proportion of it was built in the 60s and 70s and is now prone to damp, deterioration and other problems.
So hence cutting maintenance budgets has not helped with that, situation.
But with all government expenditure, the challenge is, where are the trade-offs? So I would argue that there were necessary measures that were taken by the coalition government to ensure that it was badged as austerity, but I think it was simply making sure that we dealt effectively with the outworkings of the economic crisis from 2008 onwards. So there are always hard choices, but you are right that the default position, and this was certainly true in the NHS of governments often, is to raid the capital budget in order to fund day-to-day expenditure.
Okay, let's move on to missions, because I'm interested in the extent to which you feel that your work on levelling up was a sort of analogous approach to what the government is now trying to do in terms of setting a sort of outcomes-based approach. So, based on your experience, what lessons do you think you would draw from levelling up that this government ought to learn in terms of how to do something which has a long-term outcomes-focused objective, is cross-cutting across government, and has those sorts of challenges which we very much know at the IfG are?
Yes. Well, we as I think most people here would know, in the Levelling Up white paper, had 10 missions to demonstrate whether or not the country had successfully levelled up. And they were 10-year missions, and they covered a variety of different outcomes which sought to address regional inequalities, mainly regional economic inequalities, but also inequalities in healthcare and education as well. So the first thing is, and this is a very IfG point, you have got to get the committee on mission board structure right. So one thing which I think is a mistake already is that the person chairing each mission board is from the department responsible for delivering it. This is a mistake. Not so much from my time in Levelling Up, but more from my time in other government departments and also during the COVID crisis. The health secretary, even if they're brilliant, is the wrong person to chair the COBRA when you are dealing with a pandemic. It should be a cabinet office minister, a treasury minister, or another senior figure, because you are marking your own homework. I know that it will be the case that someone could argue that the health secretary, if they're attempting to deliver transformational change, needs to have a meeting in which the education secretary is held to account for what's happening with free school meals or exercise and so on. But ultimately, you need to have the principal delivery department being held to account. The second thing is that you need regularity or frequency of meeting. So when we were preparing for Brexit and a potential no-deal Brexit, the cabinet committee that dealt with that, which is the most mission-driven cabinet committee that I've been involved in, met daily, not just Monday to Friday, but sometimes at weekends as well. Now, obviously, that is a tempo and a rate of meeting that would be unsustainable long-term and is only really suitable for a crisis or a potential crisis. But I think that a mission board should meet at least weekly in order to drive and to monitor progress. I know that from my own time, people would sometimes say within the civil service, look, we can't get the papers ready in time for a meeting of this frequency. This is, you're driving the system too hard, we're running hot. Ultimately, if you believe the mission is that important, and I think 5 missions is more than enough, but if you believe the mission is that important, then you need to ensure that you have people capable of turning around the work as effectively as possible. And you also need, within the Cabinet Office, an effective secretariat. That would be EDS, and EDS hasn't always had the care, attention, support and leadership that it needs in order to deliver.
Yeah, I have to say we have a lot of sympathy with that view, and certainly agree that with the mission boards, it's difficult to ensure that sort of accountability that you describe. Yes. With, and that's very much drawing on the experience of your work with cabinet committees, as you say, during COVID, but also during Brexit. How important would you say is the input of the Prime Minister to drive to a sort of mission-led approach? What should the involvement of the Prime Minister be?
Critical. So the Prime Minister can effectively devolve to a deputy or deputies, not strictly the DPM, but someone acting in their name. But that person needs to be understood to command the trust of the Prime Minister, to be speaking in the Prime Minister's name, and to be able, to use an East End phrase, to put manners on ministers who are not delivering. So people need to know that the word has come not just from Number 10, but from the Prime Minister's office itself, that delivery in a particular area has been slow. And it's also the case that the Prime Minister needs to not necessarily design in detail, but certainly accept, own, and take responsibility for delivery against particular metrics. Not just the end outcome, i.e. the fastest growth in the G7 or whatever it might be, but what are agreed as the component parts of that. There is no substitute for prime ministerial attention to detail. Again, not over every detail, but people need to be aware that the eye of Sauron might descend on their area at any given point if you're going to drive the change requirement.
Yeah, and you mentioned those component parts, and one of the things that we're interested in is what that sort of middle step is between the very high-level missions, the detail in the manifesto. What are the interim steps, which we're looking forward to hearing from the government. I'm curious, of the 4 prime ministers you served under, which would you say and why was most conducive to driving public service reform?
David Cameron.
And why?
I think it's the case that David had the longest apprenticeship in politics, and so therefore came to government, or came into office, with the clearest understanding of how to get the machinery overall working. It has become fashionable to scorn special advisors who become MPs and then ministers, and you can't have a government composed entirely of ministers who were special advisors. But we talk in education about the importance of apprenticeship overall, the importance of learning by doing. Being a special advisor is an apprenticeship in politics. And so David Cameron knew broadly what the culture was and what some of the blockers were in particular areas. The other thing is that he had a style of government which meant that he and George Osborne had, and Oliver Letwin, had a shrewd sense of which departments might and which ministers might best be left alone to deliver and which required closer attention. Sometimes that went wrong. The most conspicuous example of it going wrong was in health, where, and here, biography is destiny, Andrew Lansley had been David Cameron and George Osborne's boss. They had both been junior researchers in the Conservative Research Department when he had run it. They trusted him. He was super smart and knew an enormous amount about the NHS, having shadowed it for some time. But that meant that they did not, and no one in government really did, feel able to challenge Andrew sufficiently in the inception and delivery of his reforms, and that meant that potentially beneficial changes were not delivered in the way they should have been.
Very interesting. I want to go back to schools.
Yes.
According to our analysis, schools are the one major public service which is now performing better than it was in 2010. What went right in schools and wrong everywhere else?
Well, I don't know about everywhere else. I would argue that there were some other things that were successful. However, I think the several things. The first thing is, and it applies in every area, to use Francis Mauld's phrase, you need to have a high governing purpose. So you need to have a story to tell right at the very beginning. And we had a clear conception of what improvement should mean. Now, maybe this was the wrong aim, and people can legitimately criticize it. But we believed that there were 2 things that were principally wrong, headline things. One was that we were falling behind our international competitors, and that was bad for economic competitiveness in the long term and the opportunities of young people. But also the gap between outcomes for poorer and wealthier children within the state system was growing, and that needed to be addressed. So we explicitly said that we needed to raise the bar and close the gap. Within that, we developed, and we were lucky because I and a very good team were able to have 3 years in opposition to develop a plan. So we wouldn't have made the progress that we did without, and here again, I'm going to probably mention sort of a series of IfG rock stars and friends. So without Sam Friedman, without Rachel Wolfe, without Dominic Cummings, without Chris Skidmore, we would not have been able to develop the proposition or the set of propositions for education, and that was to recognise that if you're going to change something, it's a system. So that means you need to think about standards and structures. It means that you need to think about contestability and innovation within the school system overall, but you also need to think about the pipeline of talent that's coming in, and you need to think about how you have a sharper method of accountability that can adjust to take account of gaming as well.
Lots of IfG buzzwords there. How important do you think it was to have Nick Gibb as schools minister, that consistency over that period?
That helped enormously. That helped enormously. And I think that I'd say that Nick was almost sort of, he was a highly effective minister, but he was also talismanic. So it meant that as new secretaries of state, all good, arrived, and that, there was a brief period when Nick was out of the department, but it meant that he was the sort of keeper of domain knowledge and the institutional wisdom there about why we were doing things the way we were. So that it can often be the case, and quite rightly so, that if a new minister arrives, they will want to challenge things. Why are we doing this? Why on earth have we invested in that? Why on earth does this ridiculous body exist? Having someone who can say, well, I too thought that it was absurd that we did this, but the following reasons mean that it's wise. At the risk of being pretentious, there were two phrases that I used in government: the Procrustes bed and Chesterton's fence. The Procrustes bed, everyone here will know, Greek myth. Procrustes was an innkeeper. He had a bed of a particular size. If you were short, he pulled your legs so that you would fit on the bed. If you were long, he chopped them off so that you fitted in the bed. Basically, it's a pompous way of saying one size fits all doesn't work. Or it doesn't. The second thing, Chesterton's fence, G.K. Chesterton made the point, it's a very small C conservative point, but when you see a fence in the middle of a field, you think, why on earth is that there? That is ridiculous to have that. But someone once put it there for a purpose. Try to understand why it's there before you heedlessly get rid of it. Nick was the keeper of all of the Chesterton fences in education.
Yeah, I think we certainly feel here that understanding all the Chesterton fences is one of the big challenges for new ministers coming in. I want to pick up on what you said about the importance of seeing education as a system and how that sort of perspective on it helped make a success of the reforms you drove through, and take you back to the second part of my question, which is about what didn't work elsewhere, and maybe focus in particularly on the justice sector, also Justice Secretary.
Oh yes.
Do you feel that, given the problems we're now seeing, particularly in prisons, but in the justice sector more generally, that it hasn't been seen sufficiently as a system?
Yes, no, that is completely 100% correct. So there was chop and change in who was Lord Chancellor, and also some changes overall in approach towards the department and what was expected of it. So just in terms of personnel, and this is not criticism of any individual, but you had a particular approach when Ken Clarke was there, sharp reversal when Chris Grayling took over, then a change again when I was there, then a change again when Liz succeeded me. And then after that, quite a high turnover. A relative, post-Liz, a relative continuity in analysis and what required to be done, but seldom people in that role long enough in order to see it through. But the broader issue, I mean, there are all sorts of problems, but the broader issue is that the criminal justice system, as Brian Leveson has pointed out, is not one system, it is a series of siloed systems. So, after the police have arrested someone, the process of preparing the case for the CPS is often flawed and often wastes the CPS's time. The CPS, when they're preparing the case itself to go to court, are not sufficiently incentivised or sufficiently well managed in order to ensure that it operates in that the cases are prepared in a timely and rigorous fashion. Listing, i.e. deciding when trials take place and the circumstances of them, is a judicial function. I love judges, and their independence should be cherished, but they're poor managers for the most part, and that is done inefficiently. More broadly, HMCTS, which is the delivery arm of the Ministry of Justice that runs courts, again, privileges the role of judges over peripheral matters with which they should not particularly be troubled, which impedes the effective management of it. Then, let's imagine that I'm found guilty of a particular crime. The probation officer who will prepare the report that goes to the court to decide or to influence the sentencing will be a different person from the offender manager, it's basically the same set of skills, who sees me when I come into prison and assesses, where to send me initially, who will be a different person from the prison officer who will be on the wing patrolling, who will be a different person from the individual who's responsible for my education and rehabilitation in prison, who will be a different person from the person who assesses me on release, who will be a different person from the probation officer stroke offender manager who is managing me once I'm out. And so, if you can imagine a situation where you have, for the sake of argument, 4 different consultants and 12 different GPs all dealing with one condition, then it's a recipe for chaos.
It's a compelling case. After you ceased being Justice Secretary, you suggested that we send too many people to prison and for too long. Yes. Is that what you think Labour's sentencing review should conclude?
Well, I think that that is one of the what's the word? That's a headline, but it's a headline that also obscures a variety of things. So I would take a couple of steps back in the course of a sentencing review, 3 actually, and say, who composes the prison population? What are the drivers of people spending time or coming into contact with the criminal justice system and then being incarcerated? And also, which are appropriate sentences genuinely for public protection? So David Gok, whom I admire, I think has time to do a more fine-grained analysis. So I can understand why, when faced with a crisis in numbers, the first instinct would be to say, let's find the people we can release. And also I can understand why HMPPS would say, look, we'll take, obviously, we'll take a steer minister, but rather than releasing people 50% through the sentence, let's release them 40%. It's a straightforward, appears to be administratively convenient thing. But it is an example, sorry to go back, of a Procrustes bed. If one has time, what one should do is have a more effective and nuanced set of judgments about who should be released and on what terms. The second thing also is having effective supervision of offenders after release through tagging, home detention curfew and other means. And again, some of the problems there were, certainly when I was in the department, hopefully things have changed for the better now, came down to procurement. So another big issue in government is so many of the services and goods provided by government are provided by effectively an oligopoly of service companies, Serco, etc. They have both the bargaining power and the procurement expertise to run rings around even the best civil servants, with some wonderful exceptions. And that means that if you're procuring something that is technically difficult to refine, and where there are also policy issues as well, like electronic tags, you can find yourself, and we found ourselves, in a very difficult position. And that applies 1,000-fold when it comes to areas like defence procurement, different set of companies, but effectively the same dynamic, but worse.
Yeah, we are, again, very interested in these questions around public sector procurement. Just picking up on what you said there about the desirability of taking a more nuanced view of some of these challenges, I just want to loop back to what you said in answer to my first question, that Labour's committed lots of more money to the NHS,
yes,
but doesn't yet know precisely where its priorities for reform are. Is it not? What is your general view of governments coming in and setting off with lots of reforms, lots of reviews? Is that not a good thing, that they can take a little bit of time to work out where their priorities are? Yes,
I think so. But I think, again, there should be, ideally, the world is imperfect, but there should be some, to coin a phrase, oven-ready reform proposals when you begin. I had rather melodramatically in the Department for Education a photo of troops storming the beaches at Normandy. I'm sure some teachers would have thought that was my approach towards them, but actually it was a way of saying we are, and it's a privilege, we are the first on the beach in terms of reforms for the coalition government. That was fortuitous because we'd had time in opposition. The Lib Dem education spokesman David Laws and, as it happened at the time, Nick Clegg, were broadly supportive of what we were trying to do, so the stars were aligned in that regard. And it was also the case that the very first piece of legislation we'd managed to persuade Number 10 was a flagship, small, but flagship piece of education legislation. So it was a way of saying, you know, whatever else, here we are. And other reforms and other reform programs will follow on, but we're the first wave. I think it's difficult to discern exactly where the first wave of reform from this government has come. I think the area where the greatest degree of no pun intended, energy has been displayed is by Ed Miliband. But one of the questions would therefore be, is that how the government would want its domestic policy agenda to be defined? And I don't think so. So I don't believe, I mean, I don't want to invest David and George with, you know, perfect, you know, strategic oversight. But the one thing that they did do is they did, or one of many things that they did do is they said, we've got a grim economic story, but we want to have a story of reform. It will be on education and welfare, and it will be, even if we encounter opposition, it will be consistent with the message of modern compassionate conservatism. I'm not sure that I can say the same thing about the government, the Labour government now, but if people can present an account of it which can cure me of my scepticism, then I'd love to hear it.
Okay, one more question from me, and then I'm going to come to the room. So I hope everybody has their questions ready, which is to ask about what image of conservatism you think the new Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, should be projecting. What can she do to restore public trust in the Conservatives' approach to public services?
Well, I think that the widely remarked on, but absolutely correctly, she has not committed to detailed policy at this stage. And I think that's because, what the right Conservative approach will be at the time of the next general election will partly be determined by Labour's successes and failures. And I think the right approach would be to say, we don't believe, so first of all, we're looking at the NHS overall. We don't believe in moving towards an insurance system. We believe fundamentally in it being funded from general taxation and free at the point of use. Within that, we believe that there are certain changes that are probably likely to require to be made. We will look at what Labour do. If it is the case that they're making the sorts of changes that improve the NHS, then we can applaud that. There may be a small political benefit as Rachel Maskell gets queasy when Kemi Badenoch is praising Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting for their radicalism. But overall, it would be the right thing to do. But it may be that Labour don't display the sorts of changes required. So in that case, you can have a critique that evolves. I won't say more about education because obviously it's deeply personal, and people can ask if they like, but I won't sort of over-rehearse that point. But I think in other areas, there will be changes and examples from other jurisdictions. So the only other thing that I would say is, if it is the case that the Canadian Conservatives win the election, and if it's the case that they do deliver on planning reform and improving house building at a significant rate, then that will be a path for the Conservatives to emulate. Because the only other thing that I was going to say is that even though Labour in opposition, and indeed in government, have said persuasive things about planning reform, I think that their current proposals do not match the level of rhetorical ambition outlined.
Well, we shall have to see when they start to implement them. Okay, I'm going to go to questions in the room. My colleague has a microphone. I'll take questions in groups of 3, if that's okay. Please let us know who you are and where you're from. Can we go first here?
Thank you. I'm Sam Mercadante from the National Council for Voluntary Organizations. And I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points you made. So you mentioned ensuring that this additional funding for the NHS doesn't go into private companies' pockets. And with regard to criminal justice, you talked about procurement and procurement practices and capabilities. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about, are you arguing that the NHS should insource all services? Just unpack that a little bit more, and also what procurement reforms might be needed in your view with regards to the NHS.
Thank you. You go to the gentleman behind.
Hello, Andrew Haldenby from the Effective Governance Forum. Thank you so much to the IfG for putting on this wonderful event. Michael, it's very good to see you. Could I ask you to speak a bit more personally? When I speak to other ministers, they say, look, we had no time in government to think about this cause of whatever you're going to call it, reform, good government, change, productivity, value for money. My private office would put meetings in the diary from 6 a.m. till 10 at night. There's firefighting all the time, blah, 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 blah. I knew I should have been devoting time to these key, the real questions about getting more for less and so on, doing things differently, but I never had any time. I suspect from what you're saying, you were able to find the time. So I suppose the question is, do you recognise that thought, and how did you manage to make the time?
Very good. And just get on the row behind. Thank you.
Richard McCrory. I'm on the board of a body called the Office for Environmental Protection, which you created when you were the Environment Secretary of State. And it's a very unusual body. It was post-Brexit, and it's quite small, specialist audit body of government departments, public bodies with responsibility to the environment, but also critically has real legal powers if the law isn't being complied with. And it's actually, in my field, it's unique in the world. I mean, other international bodies are looking at it. The European Commission is looking at it. And so I congratulate you on that. But I wondered, in the context of today's conversation, do you think that was unique to the environment that plays a role, or do you think there are other areas of public service and public responsibilities where that sort of specialist body has a particular role?
3 brilliant questions. So firstly, I'm absolutely not averse to the private sector playing a bigger role in the delivery of healthcare. However, one worry would be that if I were the chief executive of the NHS overall, I would think, I'm under pressure to get waiting lists down. I've got a chunk of cash. I can just go to the private sector and say, can you take some of these patients off my waiting list? Here's the check. And I don't fundamentally look at how to improve delivery within the NHS itself. So I wouldn't labour the point, but that would be a concern. More broadly, on procurement, I suppose part of the question that I would ask is, or there'd be a series of questions I would ask about incentives within the NHS. I'll mention one anecdote. During COVID, we were obviously distributing PPE to hospitals, all sorts of PPE questions. But one of the things is that none of the individual NHS trusts would reveal how much PPE they actually had. Prisoner's dilemma, game theory. Because if I'm running my NHS trust effectively and I've got lots of PPE, I'm not going to say to the NHS centrally or to the supplier, hey, we're fine, give it over there. I will automatically say, oh, we're running very low. What's the amount that you're giving to everyone? Yeah, we'll take that. It's a tiny thing. But, some people would argue, well, we need better data within the NHS overall. Absolutely. But how do you get incentives at every level to align? There are other incentives for consultants to so organise they're heroes and heroines, but we're all human. They have incentives to organise their days in ways which don't necessarily maximise the efficiency of the service overall. On Andrew's point, one of the books, terrible confession, one of the books I found most useful before becoming a minister was Tony Blair's memoirs. And one of the things that's most useful is his description of office life. Obviously, the only job he had as Prime Minister, that's elevated way above my pay grade. However, he explained certain techniques. There was something that he called, when various invitations came in, he had an acronym which was FOFE, F-O-F-E, which meant fob off forever. And he had an extremely talented team who were able to say, Dr. Smith or the National Association of Puppies, Prime Minister is so committed to, but he's incredibly busy, Can I send you to Chris Mullen, who is the Minister the Prime Minister most trusts in this area? He also tells the story of one private secretary whom he had to fire, who, at the end of a half-hour meeting, when he was attempting to extract himself, the private secretary came in and said, "Your next meeting has been cancelled, Prime Minister. I know how much you're enjoying time with Fred." So part of it is having a very good private office team who will guard your time effectively and understand what it is that you want. Having junior ministers who will take some of the heat and dust of the job and accept that. And part of it also is the courage to be disliked. So sometimes you just have to say to certain organisations and groups and let it be known that you're not seeing them. And I know that there were people who often thought when George was Chancellor that he was being incredibly rude because this sector is not getting the ear of the Chancellor. But ultimately, he had to concentrate on making those big calls rather than listening to the wonderful work that hosiery manufacturers were doing. On the OEP, I think I wouldn't say the environment was a unique situation, but I would say that it's not necessarily analogous. I am one of those people who believe that when people talk about non-departmental public bodies, quangos, and so on, in an airy way, and say, there are far too many, we should get rid of them all, and so on. What you need to do is to define the different type of quango. Some of them are regulators, some of them are delivery bodies where you want to insulate the act of delivery from overt ministerial control. Some of them, yes, certainly you can question their validity, but the whole point about the Office for Environmental Protection is we have developed over time, as you know, a set of rules and principles that govern environmental enhancement. It is for government to decide whether or not each one of those rules or principles should be adjusted over time, enhanced, refined, but you need a body, once government said these are the environmental principles by which we wish to be judged, to then say whether or not you're meeting them. The other body where, which was set up by Ed Balls, where it's up to government to decide quite a lot, but they need to be kept honest, is in exam standards. Ed Balls set up an organisation called Ofqual, which, without it, all of the incentives of exam boards, government departments, and teachers could be towards grade inflation, but Ofqual, properly run and constituted, keeps them honest. But my own view is for each quango, you need to be clear overall about what its purpose is, and people who simply say, scrap them, are applying an ideology rather than a taxonomy.
We love taxonomies at the IfG. I'm going to take a couple of online questions and then one more from the room. Martin Wheatcroft asks, how can we address the reverse hypothecation caused by demographic pressures on pensions, health and social care, squeezing budgets for all other public services? There will be 25% more pensioners in 20 years, so pressures are only going to grow. We have an anonymous question. Why do you think the UK's second cities lag so far behind London?
Yes.
Compared to the economic strength of second cities in other European countries? And we'll take that. Susanna, we'll take that. Gentleman on the right there. Thank you.
Well, actually, it relates to Martin's question. This is John Peet from The Economist. You mentioned the words oven ready, and it does raise the question of social care. And you'll also remember the words Andrew Dilnot. I wonder if you have any views on why successive governments have found it so difficult to tackle social care. We remember Theresa May and Boris promising to do so, but it's just not been done.
Yeah. I'll do the second cities first, and then demographic pressure and social care questions together, if that's okay. Thanks. I don't know why it's the case that our second cities have fallen so far behind London. I think it's partly because London itself is, it's a genuinely global city in a way, I don't wish to be unfair, in a way that Paris and Amsterdam and Berlin are not, and Madrid are not quite yet, just in terms of capital flows, institutions, and so on. So, it's a super city in that regard. But I do know that there are factors that inhibit the growth of our second cities. And one of them is just their size and land hunger. Other second cities are more successful in Europe economically because they're more compact, and they also have better internal transport networks. So the length of time that it takes, so Birmingham and Leeds, Birmingham and the towns around it, the travel to work time is significantly more than it would be in Lyon, Bordeaux. But it's also the case in Leeds that we don't have an effective mass transit system. It's the largest city in Europe without one. So that is one factor. I think the other factor, which may be something to do with their failure in the past, is certainly part of the solution now, is stronger civic leadership. So, I was initially not a skeptic, but I didn't see the role, purpose, or necessity of the creation of combined mayoral authorities and mayors, and then subsequently seeing how they operated became a huge supporter of, and believe that level of leadership is a necessary but not sufficient route to improving second cities. Demographic pressures. Yes, and I think that there are some painful adjustments that one has to make, thinking about the age at which people are entitled to the state pension, and acknowledging that we are living for longer. There's been wonderful work that's been done by writers like Camilla Cavendish and others who've been looking at what it means for society and for our economy to have people living longer and capable of working and contributing for longer. But obviously, as the example of, various different governments, not least the French, in attempting to tackle this, it's not easy. And similarly, when it comes to healthcare costs, I think, in fairness, one of the things that I didn't address earlier, which is the half of the equation, as well as improving the delivery of NHS services, is improving public health overall, which improves not just life expectancy, but healthy life expectancy. One of the problems that we have, it's a big problem of economic inequality, is not just that poorer people live shorter lives, it is that poorer people, even in those shorter lives, have an even shorter period when they are fully healthy, fully capable of contributing economically, fully capable of enjoying human flourishing. So the two need to be held in balance. One of the worries sometimes is that that within DHSC, and within the NHS, a new emphasis on public health is designed to say the only problem with the NHS is that too many people want to use it. Patient, heal thyself. But I would say that both things need to be held in balance. And on John's particular point about social care, there are different aspects to it, but I think one of the main things is that it is very difficult to find a way of moving to a system of social care funding that doesn't create or reinforce certain inequalities. And one of the challenges with the Dilnot reforms, very well designed though they were, is that they did favour people who, I mean, you can argue this is a good thing, who had capital, who had been prudent, as distinct from the current situation. But the other thing, though, with social care is the misalignment of incentives at the coalface. So the NHS's desire to get people out and local government's responsibility for taking people on mean that actually the process when people are being discharged from hospital isn't truly collaborative, and quite a lot of detailed work was done by Lee Rowley when he was a minister in the department in the Living Up department to see how local government could perform that role better. But it's a very unglamorous, and it's not the, what's the word, most immediately obvious aspect of getting the system right.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I could ask many more questions, but I'm not going to have the chance. I'm sure you all could too. I'm very glad that we were not subject to FOFI
Yes.
when we invited you today. Thank you so much for joining us for a very illuminating session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have an IfG expert briefing on what the budget means for public services. We only have a 5-minute break, so while we rearrange the stage, if you could stay in your chairs, that would be fantastic, unless you absolutely must leave. Thank you.